will now move to panel 4, titled Managing Rivers in Colonial and Post-Colonial South Asia. We are delighted to have with us the following panelists: Mr. David Mickel, Senior Researcher, Environment of Peace 2022 Initiative, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Sweden; Dr. Iftikhar Iqbal, Associate Professor, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University Brunei Darussalam, Brunei; Ms. Nandini Oza, Independent Researcher and President of Oral History Association of India; and Dr. Robert Ivermy, Special Project Manager, SOAS, University of London. Chairing this panel is Dr. Amit Ranjan, Research Fellow, ISAS-UOS. Dr. Ranjan, please.
Thanks, Vinny. So I would like to welcome David first to speak. David, please.
If you can all hear me, would just like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me and to begin my presentation. I'm going to be talking about the confluence of transboundary water management, transboundary rivers in South Asia, and urban water challenges. So if you'll bear with me just 1 second, I will share my screen. Have you got my slides?
Yes, you can see.
Great. Thank you very much. So let me begin by sketching out the challenges, the problematic that I'll be trying to grapple with in this paper. South Asia faces a number of pressures and strains on its shared water resources, from rising demands and unsustainable consumption patterns to mounting environmental pressures. And the region's rapidly growing cities lie at the intersection of these colliding forces. Now, modern water governance strategies and approaches typically call for what specialists term integrated water resources management, IWRM, which basically posits that water resources should be managed holistically at the basin level. And that different water users and stakeholders should engage in participatory decision-making structures and practices to reconcile the interests and negotiate the contending demands of all water use sectors and stakeholders across the river basins. But cities in some ways challenge this interscalar policy objective because hydrologically cities represent concentrated nodes of high water demand, drawing in water from river basins and underground aquifers in which they lie, but also diverting water from other, sometimes distant river basins through interbasin water transfers and other infrastructure projects to meet their needs. By the same token, cities frequently constitute concentrated nodes of adverse environmental impacts. They generate substantial wastewater and effluent flows that may significantly impact the quantity and quality of water supplies available to other users. And at the same time, urban agglomerations cast other long-range water resource policy shadows far beyond their municipal boundaries, from the hydropower and the irrigation projects that are needed to support cities' hydroelectricity, energy and food needs, to water disaster management, protection against floods and droughts that also alter water use patterns throughout the basin. So navigating these tangled hydro-social relations and effectively integrating cities into the water basins on which they depend, in my view, will demand a new environmental and resource politics of adaptive governance strategies and nested institutions to bring cities from, as I say, islands in the stream into integrated actors within the transboundary basins in which they sit. So let me begin by simply reminding everyone that the United Nations has defined water security as the capacity of a population to safeguard sustainable access to adequate water supplies capable of sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, socioeconomic development, and for ensuring protection against waterborne pollution and water disasters, all within a climate of political stability. And it's the approach of integrated or sometimes what's called adaptive water resources management to try and bring that water security to fruition. What rivers, what water resources are we talking about when we look at South Asia? Here we see the major river systems of Asia, and from the outlines of the basins on the map, it's quite clear their transboundary nature surpasses national boundaries, but also surpass subnational boundaries of provinces and states within national borders, and that cities, of course, are points within these extensive transboundary basins. So there is a geographical intersection, a geographical web of interconnections across the waterscapes in which cities sit. But there's also a cross-sectoral or trans-sectoral network of demands and influences in what is sometimes called the water, energy, food nexus, by which we mean simply that water supplies are employed not only for drinking and cleaning and household uses, but of course they support agricultural production. They support the generation of power, not only through hydroelectricity, but also because water is used for cooling thermal power plants, and that the relationship in between water, energy, and food resources is one of synergies and competitions and trade-offs, that water managers must make choices about how to employ water resources in order to meet food demands, agricultural production, or to meet hydropower demands. And likewise, it requires energy to produce and transport and purify water. And it also requires energy to prepare and store and ship food. By the same token, many agricultural resources can also be used as biofuels. So there's a web of interrelationships in between not only the hydrological spaces of transboundary rivers, but also between the different sectoral uses and users of those resources. And in South Asia, these resources are already under considerable stress. On this global map, you see, if my cursor is showing up on your screens, the considerable pressure on major river basins of the world, many of which, particularly in South Asia, are already considered closed or near closed, which means essentially that all of the available renewable water resources in those basins are already allotted to existing human or ecosystem needs, with very little margin for maneuver left over to accommodate new users or new strains or new needs. And that's only to speak of surface water resources. Groundwater resources, underground aquifers, are also under substantial stress, so much so that the depletion of aquifers can be registered from space. The map in the upper right here shows results from the GRACE satellites, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment satellites, which register changes in the Earth's magnetic field due to changes in underground aquifers, and the deficits in the Indo-Gangetic plains already equal on an annual basis the storage capacity of India and Pakistan in the reservoirs of India and Pakistan in those same regions. So the groundwater depletion is rapidly offsetting the water manager's storage capacity in those same areas of South Asia. And if you put these strains on surface water resources and groundwater resources together, in many months of the year, in fact, if not all year long, the combined surface and groundwater resources of South Asia are not sufficient to meet the user's demands on a monthly basis in terms of renewable supplies. These are the strains which are already impacting South Asia's water resources. And what's driving these strains? Well, in part, it is population growth and urbanization. And here we see the population density of river basins across South Asia and East Asia as well, and the projected populations of the two largest countries in the region, India and Pakistan. But throughout the region, populations are rising, and urbanization is also increasing. And this puts additional strains and demands on the water, energy, food nexus that we evoked earlier. So essentially, what we can say about rising population and urbanization is the same thing that the American bank robber, Willie Sutton, said when he was asked, why does he rob banks? He responded, well, that's where the money is. And if we want to address the question of why is population growth and particularly urbanization Why is this a challenge for water managers and the water energy food nexus? The answer is because that's where the people are, increasingly in cities and in urban areas. So to meet the demands of rising populations, particularly urban populations, the needs for domestic water demand, manufacturing, thermal cooling of power plants in South Asia will all be growing out to mid-century. And likewise, the rising food demands in South Asia will be met by increased agricultural production, and that agricultural production in turn requires more water use. So if we look at South Asia as a whole, projections would suggest that just by mid-century, 3 decades away, water demands in South Asia will rise by 18 to 25% to meet all of these needs. And that's driven in good measure by cities and urbanization and rising water demand in cities. This increasing use, in turn, has consequences for the rivers and water supplies on which populations and urban populations depend. One of those consequences is rising pollution, that the rivers of South Asia, and this is just an example for nitrogen pollution, are already largely meeting and projected to surpass their accommodation capacity for pollutants. These pollutants are generated not only by agriculture, farming to meet food demands, but also by increasing industrial uses that are introducing toxic chemicals and heavy metals into the water supply. And cities, in turn, do not generally do a sufficient job in treating and purifying those wastewaters. So that across South Asia, only about 10 to 15% of urban wastewater is ever treated in any way at all. Most of it is released simply back into rivers and lakes and eventually the ocean. Likewise, to meet rising energy demands, most of the countries of South Asia are projected and planning to increase their hydropower capacity. This is a goal not only to meet power needs, but also in partial response to the impacts of climate change and to decarbonize their fuel supplies. So here we see the comparison between hydropower potential and actual capacity developed in the Indus Basin. We also see the importance of hydropower to a number of countries in the region, including Nepal, which generates all of its energy, all of its power comes from hydropower. So the countries in the region have ambitions to continue to expand that capacity in order to meet energy demands that are growing, for example, in India at about 7% a year, or were before the COVID pandemic. And yet in India, again, with the demands rising 7% a year, there was about a 7% annual shortfall between energy demands and needs. We can actually see these combined human pressures on the water supplies of South Asia if we compare agricultural needs, human demands, environmental pressures. On these maps, we see rising water stress in the nodes of water stress on the water supplies, the rivers of South Asia. These red areas represent points where the water stress, the human pressures, the anthropogenic pressures have doubled just in the space of 1990 to 2014. And on the map in the lower corner, this distinguishes in between irrigation demands in yellow and then urban, municipal, other industrial demands in red, and combined farming and municipal demands in purple. So all of these red and purple nodes are those nodes of demand and impact represented by cities, towns, and urban concentrations. And those demands and those pressures are rising over time. To throw into the mix, climate change, which we've heard much about in the previous session, is altering the seasonal and geographical availability and regularity of water supplies across the region. And this is a somewhat complicated table, but really what I would like to present here, more than any particular number or any particular forecast, is just the range of numbers in the different brackets, representing the range of projections of the water supply gap out towards the end of the century, according to different modeling scenarios. And the takeaway from this table is simply the degree of uncertainty, season by season, pre-monsoon, during the monsoon, according to different scenarios. That for water managers, part of the challenge of grappling with these growing environmental and human pressures on shared water supplies is the uncertainty about what supplies will be available when, where, under climate change scenarios. The strategies for grappling with these challenges, that, as I mentioned earlier, are typically framed in terms of integrated water resources management, viewing basins holistically, but also cooperatively between water users, stakeholders, and sectors. But just to look at the international level, very few of the rivers in South Asia, just looking at the scale and means of international cooperation, very few of the rivers in South Asia actually are governed by any type of international agreement or treaty. The Indus and the Ganges stand out, but if we take just the example of the Indus water treaty, for example, it includes only 2 of the 4 riparians. The Indus water treaty is an agreement between India and Pakistan, but does not include upstream riparian China on the one hand, or Afghanistan on the other. So at the international scale, the types of governance agreements that would enable water managers or facilitate water managers wrestling with the competing demands and priorities of different stakeholders are not in place in South Asia. Complicating the picture further are the different scales and jurisdictions and institutions that are typically charged with addressing different water use stakeholders, different water use sectors, and different geographies. So here we see simply a map on the one hand of India's groundwater aquifers on the left, and on the right, this is now a somewhat dated map of India's electrical grid. These grids have now been connected so that there's more transmissibility between the different grids. But the point here is simply that in managing water resources and managing the water energy food nexus, the boundaries of the river basins that we saw earlier, the underground aquifers that we see in the map on the left, and the electrical grids through which hydropower can be distributed to users, these boundaries don't coincide. So when we speak of managing basins holistically, as a whole and across stakeholders and users, the question arises of who actually is a stakeholder for which use. It's easy to see on the electrical grid map, for example, that the Ganges Basin overlaps 2 different portions of the electrical grid, and that electricity is transmissible now between those grids. Likewise, for food supplies, Punjab in India sits within the Indus Basin, but it produces wheat and rice that account for about 2/3 to 3/4 of the national food stocks, the buffer stocks for the whole country of India, so that there are stakeholders and consumers of food products produced by water from the Indus Basin. There are consumers and stakeholders in those food products that live outside the basin. So when we try to approach water management through these integrated processes, participatory management, who counts, who needs to be included for which uses, and cities represent a microcosm of that conglomeration of different stakeholders, different demands. Cities draw in electricity, food products, people from far beyond their own borders and beyond the borders of the aquifers and the river basins in which they sit. So finally, I'd just like to illustrate these challenges with a couple of more maps that evoke two different problems. One is the impact of water management on urban areas and urban agglomerations. This is a map of the delta, the southwest region of Bangladesh, where we see changes in river salinity that are induced both by sea level rise due to climate change, but also by the reduction in flows coming downstream in the Ganges and the Brahmaputra system due to upstream water demands. The more that water is diverted upstream for irrigation, for municipal demands, for hydropower, the lower the flows coming down into the delta, and the lower the flows, the higher the intrusion of salt water into the delta. What that means for residents of the delta is what's illustrated in the table down on the bottom right, which basically shows that where these regions of higher salinity are impacting communities and livelihoods, they are driving down household wealth and ability to earn living, and in turn driving migration out of these areas. So the higher the band of saline intrusion, the higher the salinity of the soil, the more difficult it is to realize agricultural production. And these zones of higher salinity correspond to the zones of higher out migration, particularly to Dhaka and other urban areas in Bangladesh. So that water management of these transboundary river systems as a whole, both in Bangladesh itself, but also upstream in India, are impacting urban population patterns within Bangladesh itself. And the next map shows, this is Chennai, which doesn't sit within one of the international transboundary basins, but is still a transboundary water user and represents a transboundary basin at the subnational level, because the boundaries of the Adya River, which is one of the rivers that supplies Chennai, overlaps with different political boundaries of the city itself and surrounding regions. And here we see the impacts of urbanization of the city on, in return, the surrounding river system. The upper the upper right is changing land use patterns. And here we just see the expansion of the urban area of Chennai as more and more of Chennai becomes built up. That in return is impacting the permeability of land surfaces in the urban area and the surrounding area, and is impacting the flood damages caused when monsoon rains, but also stronger storms and higher precipitation that's being driven in part by climate change. When those water flows come downstream, come down the river collected from this basin and flow into Chennai, the impermeability of surfaces, the channelization of waters caused by the greater buildup of land surfaces is increasing flood damage and flood depth in Chennai. So here we see the reciprocal and mutual impacts between what is urban development on river systems on the one hand, and river management on urban development and population patterns on the other hand, in the previous example of Bangladesh. Finally, just like to conclude by drawing all of these different factors together, the environmental pressures on water resources, the human pressures on water resources, and the governance challenges of managing these water resources, zooming back out again to the international transboundary level, and look at the combination and the interaction of these factors in South Asia. The major basins of South Asia are considered particular hotspots for transboundary water challenges due to the combination of all of these factors of environmental water stress. This is just a zoom in on the Ganges-Brahmaputra basin here, but the indicators for environmental water stress, human water stress, which is cities, but also governance challenges, and finally, nutrient pollution, which is both agriculture pollution and industrial and municipal water pollution. All of these factors together are making the water picture for the future of transboundary basins in South Asia particularly challenging. So we need to find ways to bring water users, stakeholders, political representatives from cities into conversations around water management in these basins. And this is not typically the case, that cities are not usually represented as cities in, certainly not within international treaties or river basin organizations, but also at the national level, where responsibilities are typically divided between different jurisdictions of ministries and agencies, which may be or may not be represented by municipal water utilities and other users. So it's a complicated picture that represents a real challenge for South Asia going forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. You have presented a good picture of what South Asia's water is. But we see that widening demand supply gap, escalating water nationalism, then talking more about establishing absolute sovereignty over the common shared resources, water resources. Then there's also issue of linking water, transboundary waters with security issue, military security issue that first happened in 2016 and then again in 2018, especially between India and Pakistan. So these issues are also posing big challenge because the picture you presented, if we have to face the challenge together. We cannot, India cannot face alone, or Pakistan cannot face alone, or Bangladesh cannot face alone, because the structure we have. So you can talk about this issue in discussion session. And thanks for the presentation. Yeah, discussion. Now I would like to invite Iftikhar to present his paper.
Yeah. Thank you, Amit. Just let me share my. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Amit Ranjan and Professor Ian Talbot for having me here. And I slightly changed the title of my paper thanks to a conversation yesterday, and David Michael have set the tone for me in a very wonderful and graphic way. So I'll try to connect to some of his observations later on. To begin with, I think I would be dealing here with the question of the river, Southeast Asian, rivers in Southeastern Asia, as a commons in the Eastern South Asia region. By Eastern South Asian rivers, I would refer to the lower Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Meghna systems that include at least 50 rivers. Okay. Second. Okay, so here, as you can see, these 54 rivers are garlanding Bangladesh from west to north to northeast to the east, all over around the more than 4,000 kilometers of India-Bangladesh border. And in the conversation, in the dialogues and the discussions about these rivers, that these 54 rivers that goes into Bangladesh, we are familiar with these terms of water sharing, water diplomacy, integrated water management, and so on. And these vocabularies have emerged from the particular set of interstate relations since decolonization. And water is seen as a mineral that can be measured in cubic feet or per second, and then riparian states can set the rules, take their share, or negotiate or engage and follow the rules, or ignore them. And if negotiation or nothing works in terms of negotiations, the possibility of conflict and war are not ruled out, as many existing literature suggest. Now, what if we ask a different set of questions? What is the state's business in these rivers? What is it like when these post-colonial rules and regulations and languages were not deployed as much as they deployed and in the discourses? And what if the riparian river people, from the source to the sink, use these waters as much as the need without hindering the flows of the water, the silt, and the biodiversity? And what if we don't measure the waters in cusecs at the bottom of the barrages or dams, but in the community needs? Why do we talk about the rights of the abstract entity of the state and not the rights of the human and more than human entities who inhabit the basins. Well, these are certainly naive lines of thoughts and an experience in almost impossibility. But I would suggest that much of the vocabulary used in the study of the international rivers of these regions may be complemented by a new set of vocabularies and frameworks to grapple with the gravity of the challenges that the planetary and anthropogenic ecological problems have posed, issues which are larger than the post-colonial states. And we need to go beyond the technicalities, as Rohan Soja was telling yesterday, referring to, of environmental problems. What calls for greater scrutiny is the question of how to reclaim the riverine commons that the decolonization and the state formation process have dissented. This, I believe, demands an environmental historical perspective and the deepening of the debates on both pre and post national perception of the rivers of the region. For example, as Amit Ranjan's recent book, Contested Waters, have alluded to, I would look at three areas in this regard. First, ideologies and historical phases of decommonization. Second, I would look at the few examples of how these schemes have led to common anthropogenic challenges. And to make sure I stay close to the conference focus, I would also briefly refer to the urban growth in relation to the fallout of this decommonization, particularly Dhaka. And I would conclude by a note on the challenges and hopes of recommunization. And for these three phases of decommunization, for the first one, the first attack, if you like, if I can call the decommunization 1.0, the first attack on the Ganges commons came not from the partition of 1947 as such, but because of how the political act of partition was preemptively used to dislodge the rights of the lower riparian. And Cyril Ratcliffe suggested, who figured out the maps of post-colonial South Asia, he suggested for fixing boundaries in a way to avoid disruption to the water basins and to avoid future problems between India and Pakistan. Mountbatten and his advisors ignored this and hoped that, I quote, India herself would be prepared to arrange with Pakistan the uses of their common waters, mind the unquote, and mind the word common waters. This was included in that response. And Nehru's subsequent comment that what India did with India's waters, rivers, was India's affairs. I take this quote from Helmut Kohl's, as is well-known article from 1969. And this Nehru's comment actually proved Ratcliffe right and Mountbatten wrong. In the run-up to the discussion on the Farakka project, the then Pakistan government suggested that lower riparian country was free to use its water resources without any obligations. But upper riparian countries could not unilaterally do the same. In response, Nehru suggested that such practice would, I quote, enable the lower riparian to create unilaterally historic rights in its favor and go on inflating them at its discretion, and thereby completely blocking all development and uses of the upper riparian, unquote. And all this set the tone for future future for water sharing and negotiation and state level practices between India and Pakistan, and later on between India and Bangladesh. By 1951, Farakka barrage was on the Ganges was firmly on official footing. From the beginning, it was a nationalist project. A Bengali author noted that the amount of earth excavated, this is from 1960s, late 60s, for the excavated for this could be used to create a 45 centimeter wide and 30 centimeter high embankment dam from the earth to the moon. And it was hoped that the sill to Calcutta in Calcutta port would wash away with regular flow of water from Farakka barrage. Dredging cost would be cut, and ships with 8 to 10 meter draft could enter Hooghly easily. So here is the Farakka barrage, just a few kilometers from Bangladesh border. And with that, I'll jump to decommonization 2.0. If the first wave of decommonization eyed on the Calcutta port, the second wave focused on energy. Within 4 months after the birth of Bangladesh in March 1972, the pressing issue of Farakka was added by talks on cooperation on the feasibility, I quote, of linking the power grids of Bangladesh with the adjoining areas of India so that the water resources for the region can be utilized on an equitable basis for the mutual benefit of the people of the two countries. This essentially meant that the dams were coming on many of the 54 common rivers on India and Bangladesh. And later on, Tista barrage in Ghazal-Jaba with its 44 sluice gates. You can see the Tista barrage over here, north of Farakka, and Tista is a tributary to Brahmaputra. And this is just 50 kilometers from Bangladesh's northern district of Rangpur. This exemplified the ongoing process that is started in terms of the second wave of decommonization running for energy. And in the northeast, Tipaimukh Dam is already commissioned. You can see the Tipaimukh Dam here. This river Borak, and it has Shurma and Kushiara river coming from river Borak, and they are again joining Brahmaputra system. And this is still planned and probably under construction, but not into operation because of conversation and debates between Bangladesh and India. And further down in the east, in Tripura, the Gomti Dam is already in operation. I think it should be, Gomti Dam should be here, somewhere here on the upstream of Meghna River. So it is garlanded in, as you can see. And then if we go to decommonization, the third wave of decommonization, the decommonization 3.0, we have this third wave was especially far more ambitious, larger, and complex, and through different reincarnations in the ideas of Arthur Cotton's, K.L. Rao's, and Dinshaw Dastur in the late 1970s. These has finally shaped as the National River Linking Project that Amit Ranjan was just mentioning. And this project aims to connect 44 rivers via almost 10,000 kilometers of canals. And needless to say, Brahmaputra and the Ganges are the mainstay of this project. And if you see this map, this is the late 1970s Dastur's, Dinshaw Dastur, a pilot who designed this kind of planning. This is his plan is called the Garland Canal System. So this is the part that connects Brahmaputra and Ganges. This was kind of foreshadowing what is today's NRLP, National River Linking Project. Now, I think this is the latest version of this pan-Indian, if you like, project to draw water of Brahmaputra and Ganges to the rest of India in different ways. So all these phases of decommonization had its origin in the modernist engineering protocol of the colonial time, and the post-colonial Indian state has been pretty consistent in giving them new leases of life periodically, whatever is happening in the central politics. But this decommonization comes with some common threats that we are all aware, and some of the issues have already been mentioned by David now. So I would not repeat all these here. Since we speak from the vantage point of the commons, it is not enough to merely focus on the impact of upper riparian interventions onto the lower riparian. We need to examine the impact on all morphological locations over the body of the river, over the body of any river we are talking about here. In West Bengal itself, it was reported as early as February 1973 that the Farakka barrage had raised the water level in the Ganges by 15 feet. Erosion along the length of 50 miles and 8 to 10 miles in width was noted. 250 crores worth of property was destroyed, and 100,000 people became homeless. And these were debated in the West Bengal Assembly. An MP noted that 175 crore spent through the tears of our people will go in vain, and instead 250 crore worth of money will be destroyed. And it was said that we are calling the engineers doing this as modern Bhagirath, the god who brought the river Ganges, personified in the river goddess Ganga, to earth from heavens. This modern Bhagirath, he is saying, couldn't take Mother Ganga to the Port Calcutta to save it, but arrests were made protesting this. So talking about the arrest of people protesting this during that time. And in the course of the past 45 years, the discourse remains the same. According to Kolkata Port Trust data, silt dredging at the port increased from 6.40 million cubic meters annually from pre-Farakka days to 4 times at about 22 million cubic meters annually during 2003. On the top of this, the spatial scope of the impacts are broadened to include Bihar. In 2017, Bihar Chief Minister Nitish Kumar blamed the Farakka for siltation in the Ganges and the flooding in 12 riparian districts in Bihar, claiming 20 lives and affecting about 2 million people. He also noted the severe impediments in the movement of fishes, such as hilsha and chingri prawns, which were in the verge of being extinct. You can see it here. And he also noted the adverse impact of dolphin sanctuary at Bhagalpur. And Nitish Kumar also strongly urged for decommissioning the Farakka. So the spatial dimension actually changed and moved, so as the extent of failure of the Farakka in terms of its stated intention to desilt the Calcutta port region and the Hooghly River. Now, the impact of Farakka on the lower stream in Bangladesh is highly documented, and I'm not going to repeat this here. Just to note on a rather existential, more existential problem over the more spatial, bigger space of the delta itself, that the 1996 treaty had hardly ameliorated the situation. Soil nutrients, salinity, erosion, irrigation facilities, silt deposition, flooding, and so on. I just mentioned one recent report, and it says that the large quantities of the silt gets trapped upstream of the Farakka barrage. So Farakka is a bottleneck, and downstream areas don't receive a lot of silt, quote and unquote. And this is one of the major reasons for the land subsidence in the delta. And if sea level rise in the south is considered, the Bengal Delta Bengal Delta's fate is sealed. The impact of Tista barrages, as you saw on the map, are also well documented. And the projected dam in Tipaimukh is also going to have multiple impact. This includes the wetland ecologies of the states of the region east of the Brahmaputra, both in Bangladesh and northeastern India, including the Haors and Bills that Shajal Nag mentioned yesterday. So this is the Haor area where the rainfall that are falling in the Meghalaya, most of them settle there, and that they create a whole lot of ecosystem services for not only for local people and regional people from neighborhood, but also from birds from Siberia who come there in the spring and in summer, spring and the winter. So for the National River Linking Project, we have no clear idea of its impact as yet in the real world context, but it is predicted that it will result in almost 70 up to 75% of reduction in sediment flow in the Ganga and up to 25% of reduction in the Brahmaputra. Overall sediment deposition in the delta is set to decrease from 3.6 to 2.5 millimeter annually, which is large enough to further accelerate the sea level rise in the delta. And in the context of more direct human social predicaments due to decommonization, I would now refer to the issue of migration to cities from these borderline areas, and David Mikkel has already mentioned that, thankfully. So Farakka and Tista barrages have shattered the ecosystem historically created by the Padma or Ganges and Tista river systems on both sides of the border, but more so in Bangladesh side, as I mentioned above. Erosion, flooding due to sudden release of water in rainy season, and withdrawing water during the dry season. All these have led to loss of paddy lands, fisheries, and so on, leading to a significant number of people to move to urban centers. And several Indian sources had earlier reported cross-border Bangladeshi migration to Calcutta, Delhi, Mumbai, and some other areas in Delhi from the 1970s through the 1990s, and estimated at more than 1 million between 1981 and 1991. However, since the late 1990s, there has been a remarkable shift in migration trends within Bangladesh, being more towards urban areas inside domestically in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, and also in Chittagong. Now, let me give you an empirical assessment very briefly. As an example, there are about 2 million rickshawpoolers in Dhaka city, comprising almost 10% of the city's population. Where do they come from? A 2018 survey shows that of the 8 administrative divisions in Bangladesh, only 28% of rickshawpoolers come from the 4 coastal divisions, which corroborates also David Mitchell's observations that there are movement in inbound, domestic migrations from the coastal regions to Dhaka. But interestingly, about 58%, almost 60%, came from the 2 divisions bordering India, affected by Farakka and Tista barrage. What I'm trying to suggest here is that Dhaka's economic growth over the last 3 decades has opened up new destinations for poverty-stricken people from Bangladesh's peripheral districts, replacing earlier pattern of migration to some areas to India. This has 2 implications. First, the ecological shocks posed by Farakka and Tista have led to unusual and unsustainable growth of Dhaka's population, putting a lot of strains in the urban life. And secondly, if Bangladesh's economic growth slows down, and if Bangladesh's borderlands dotted with the common basins are not restored to ecological, agroecological sustainability and ecosystem services, the terms that have been used yesterday and today, the migration could move westward to Calcutta and beyond. So this is where I see a potential common challenges posed to India and Bangladesh because of unbridled decommonization of the river and ecology. So to conclude, with a much well-known note of caution, messing with nature doesn't do any good to anyone, human, non-human, or the atmospheres. It's never cost-effective economically, socially, or politically, and with the added threat from climate change, the Eastern South Asian rivers future and look really bleak, to say the least. But at the same time, deeper conversations on the challenges and opportunities around restoring the riverine commons of Eastern South Asia and rivers could provide rays of hope and for millions in Bangladesh and India. In going back to the question of the possibility of reclaiming the commons in the region, I'm not just looking merely from the perspective of the river basins inside Bangladesh. I'm looking at the entire body of the flows of the 54 international rivers as a common habitat for human and more than human entities. And this perspective allows one to see through the urges of reclaiming the commons as reflected, for example, in the efforts of Uttarakhand state to bestow the Ganges with the status of live personhood, or in the quest of the state of Bihar to decommission the Farakka barrage. But at the Indian national policy level, these urges are registered in a different wavelength. And these fault lines partly, and these problems in translation, partly linked to the question of both scale and space, which in a general broader context, Ian Talbot referred to yesterday. And I think this is important question, how Bihar, Uttarakhand, and Bangladesh perceive the Ganges, and how localized popular practices in Bihar, in Bangladesh, and in Uttarakhand see Ganges as a common from their own localized perception, and then how these multiple localized, especially localized context and practices and policies and desires and urges add up to the more larger spatial scale around the body of the rivers, from the source to the sink. These are the questions, I think, that needs and demands a deeper probing. And that's why I think the idea of the commons is not really an idealist projection. There is hope, but I think we need to negotiate the terrains, the need for energy, the need for the development, the need for the question of upgrading the livelihood of people. These are important as the ecosystem that sustain all these desires in the long run, which are also far more important than this. How to negotiate these two sets of issues, two sets of destinations and trajectories, is something that needs to be grappled. So thank you for the opportunities.
Thank you, Iftikhar, for your wonderful presentation. Just for 1 minute, I want to read what there is Jinnah, Nehru, and Radcliffe on water issue. I'm reading from my own paper on this issue. It is yet to be published. Mm. It is believed that as a last-minute effort to keep the canal and irrigation system uninterrupted, according to Leonard Mosley's account, before making his award, Radcliffe approached Jinnah and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, seeking an agreement that Punjab water system should be a joint venture run by both countries. For this, that is Radcliffe, was rewarded for his suggestion by a joint Muslim-Hindu review. Jinnah told him to get on with his job and informed that he would rather have Pakistan deserts than fertile fields watered by courtesy of Hindus. Nehru curtly informed him that what India did with India's rivers was India's affair. Both leaders were obviously furious with him and hinted that he has playing politics. Quote close. Then about any such meeting, in one of his interview that was published in Kripal Singh's book on selected documents on Punjab partition. In his interview, Radcliffe said that, and I quote, "I did not initiate any talk with the political leaders for joint control of irrigation system in Punjab, but we were discussing this issue among our colleagues, and through them, I knew that they were not going to agree to the joint control." Quote close. On Mosley's account of this, Niranjan D. Gulati, the man who led India in Indus water talks with Pakistan, observes, and I quote, "Should these statements be correct, there was little basis for the hope expressed by Radcliffe for some joint control of the canals and headworks by the two states." So there are many versions of and interpretations of what went through. And anyways, an excellent presentation. And I have a question that you talk about migration, people migrating from border areas with India and coming to Dhaka. So that migration has also led to encroachment of water bodies in Dhaka. And there were high courts, Dhaka high courts ruling on this. So I would like you to focus on this also during this discussion session. And thanks. Now I would like to invite Nandini. Nandini, please. Hello, Nandini. You are muted.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see you now. Yeah,
okay.
We can listen also.
And can you hear me also?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me, especially the Institute of South Asian Studies. And since we are, I think, running a little late, I will quickly start my presentation, which is on the city and environment history in colonial and post-colonial India. I'll be talking about the case of Sardar Sarovar project and Sabarmati river front. The reason why I will be talking about the Sardar Sarovar project is because it's one of the largest dams in India on the river Narmada, built in the state of Gujarat, Western India, and with huge environment and human costs. And it has one of the longest anti-dam movements also in the country. So it's also a project where for the first time in the history of World Bank, it had to withdraw because of people's opposition to the project. So I'll be focusing on this particular dam, also because I was a full-time activist of this project, and the Sabarmati river front, which is now touted as a very modern way of converting rivers that flow in our cities for beautification. So where again the waters from this project are flowing. So I will be talking of this particular case, and this photograph is of the late 80s of the people who have been opposing the Sardar Sarovar project. The Adivasis, the tribal people, are taking a pledge in late 80s that they will come what may stop this dam, because it was going to lose, they were going to lose their livelihood, their homes and villages. So Why am I not able to share my slides?
Yeah, can you move it? The second one. Second one. No.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see only one.
Can you see
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah. Now we can see.
Okay, okay. So, so my case is that cities in India expanded at the cost of rural India. This was entrenched during pre-colonial period and has continued in post-colonial India also. One way in which the cities have thrived is by conquering the natural world by building large dams, diverting the river waters, and hydropower for its ever-growing needs. So metros have taken it all. This is the photograph of Bombay. You can see how the consumption of power is. One of the Mulshi Dam built by the Tata company during the British rule in the 1920s. It was built to provide power to the city of Mumbai. It also witnessed the first anti-dam struggle in the country called the Mulshi Satyagraha. The dam got completed in midst of stiff opposition and repression on the affected people. Women were also jailed. The power went to the city of Mumbai. Actually, even today, the 52 villages that were displaced are still continuing to fight for their basic rights. Their second and the third generation still are raising demands for some sort of resettlement in the state of Maharashtra, where this dam has been built near Pune. Another example of a large dam built during the British period is the Krishnaraj Sagar Dam on River Kaveri, completed in 1938. Again, provides water to the cities of Mysuru and Bangalore, and Mysore. And this whole thing of having another man-made, ornamental, luxurious garden near the dam site also came up in place of, the organic ecological growth of vegetation near the dam in 1938. So these are the two cases during the British rule where waters of rivers through dams were transferred to the growth of cities for its power and water needs. This legacy continued even after India got its independence, and our first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, during the dedication of the Bhakra Dam to the nation in 1963, it is his famous statement that Bhakra Nangal project is the new temple of resurgent India. We all grew up studying this in our textbooks, So the dam building exercise continued. The legacy continued post-independence also. It is being said that Nehru revised his opinion in 1958 that such developmental projects reflect a disease of giganticism. However, the spate of building dams continued. And if we look at the data, which is not very accurate, but put in the Lok Sabha Secretariat reference note in 2013, these kind of aggressive developmental projects, mainly dams and mines, have led to about displacement of about 60 million people from 1947 to 2000. Nearly half of these people displaced are due to dams, and half of these displaced are also belonging to the Adivasi, the tribal communities in India. So, other estimates say that this is a very underestimated data. 3 to 4 times the number have been displaced by these kinds of projects in the country over a 50-year period. And at the same pace, we are still displacing our own people through this kind of large, aggressive development projects. Coming to the Sardar Sarovar project on the river Narmada in Western India, 245 villages are going to be submerged with a population of 250,000 people. Another 250,000 people are to be affected by related works. And I want to share that actually, even before our government gave clearance to this project, the Ministry of Environment gave clearance to this project, the World Bank had already sanctioned a loan to this project, before the studies and clearances were given by our own government. So the claims that were made of this project, the justification was that the Sardar Sarovar project, this dam, a very large dam, was to quench the thirst of the drought-prone areas of the state of Gujarat permanently, These are some of the government propaganda which has gone around the project, a huge, massive campaign that this will permanently solve the food needs, the drought-prone area needs, the drinking water needs, and it will convert the whole state of Gujarat into Nandanvan. So these were the claims. However, these claims were challenged by the affected people's powerful movement, popularly called the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Many of you may have heard. The people who were to be affected and are to be displaced by the project did not only challenge it on the grounds that no rehabilitation was taking place or the environment impacts were huge, but the people also challenged the claims that this project is not going to be solving the water problems of the state of Gujarat. In fact, the Narmada Bachao Andolan on record has even said that it will basically transfer the water from the marginalized sections of the society to the already powerful and politically strong areas of Gujarat. Although the project plan said that the water from this dam will not go to the cities of Gujarat like Baroda and Ahmedabad, the Narmada Bachao Andolan insisted that once the dam will be completed, the project reports will not be looked into, and actually the waters will flow to the large cities also, though not planned. And these arguments of the movement were not considered. The dam got completed in 2017, resulting into massive displacement. 245 villages, I'm just sharing some photographs here, have been submerged, and 250,000 people in the reservoir area have been impacted. There has been a huge loss of forest, 13,000 hectares of forest lost in this one dam alone, 4,500 hectares of forest cleared for rehabilitation purposes. But the national figure is even more grim. I would like to share that 7 million hectares of forest and 6 million hectares of other common property resources from 1947 to 2000 have been lost to this kind of developmental projects, which includes dams, minings, industries, so on and so forth. So it's quite a grim situation. And what the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the people's movement, said is coming out to be true. This is one of the very, touted as a model project which has come up in the city of Ahmedabad. Our current Prime Minister belongs to the state of Gujarat, where this dam has been completed during his tenure as Prime Minister. The Ahmedabad city in Gujarat, is located on the Sabarmati River, but because of a dam on the upstream, this river had gone dry. All its water has been used up before it enters the city of Ahmedabad. So basically, it was just a kind of a dry riverbed, and so Sabarmati riverfront, by building concrete, iron, and promenade kind of structure in 11 kilometers of the city has come up. And what was said that the Narmada waters from the Sardar Sarovar Dam will not be used for the Narmada for the Ahmedabad city, were actually now have been diverted for filling up this riverfront project. So the dry Sabarmati River now has the waters from the Narmada from the Sardar Sarovar Dam in the city of Ahmedabad for an 11-kilometer stretch, again displacing the marginalized sections. You can see on the left-hand side top, living on this riverbank, they've all been displaced, and the whole area, 11-kilometer area, has been concretized. So on the other hand, near the Sardar Sarovar Dam, when the now all of you must have heard that India now boasts of the tallest statue in the world. So this has come up on Adivasi lands, which were first acquired for the project colony of this dam, Sardar Sarovar. So once the dam got completed, instead of returning those lands back to the people because the storehouses, the offices were not required, these lands were put to use for 5-star tourism purposes. More Adivasi lands are being acquired, and the tallest statue in the world has come up after 2017. And the irony is that we have also now developed 5-star tourism to take people through seaplanes from the Sabarmati riverfront to Kevadia colony near the dam site. So what the Narmada Bachao Andolan was claiming that this project, more than quenching the thirst of the people, is going to really meet the needs of the already powerful, already, in different ways, politically strong people and areas. So, and on the other side, what we see is that because of this dam, 110-kilometer stretch of the river Narmada below the dam, which was once a perennial river, has gone dry for about 8 months in a year. We have water now only during the monsoon, and 10,000 fishing families have been severely impacted, lost their livelihood. Cities like Bharuch and Ankleshwar, which are on the banks of this river, have suddenly find that their river has, the waters has been blocked upstream. So this is another impact in the downstream by the Sardar Sarovar project. And so I would like to say that the colonial legacy has continued. Development paradigm of building large dams for expansion, beautification, and needs and greeds of cities continue, often throttling dissent. You can see that when people oppose, we have police intervention. The state terms people who oppose this kind of project, demand alternatives, are called anti-national. And the colonial legacy, not in terms of just this design, but I would say involvement of international financial institutions like the World Bank, also push this kind of project. So and I mean, so there is a continuity in even funding and push for these kinds of projects, as we see in the Sardar Sarovar, where the World Bank was involved even before we got the clearance. So I would like to share the voice of a very senior Adivasi leader of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Pervi Bai, and the thoughts that the indigenous and tribal communities think about these projects. What do they feel about dams on rivers? She will be speaking in Bhilali. I have done the translation here in English. So I will share her voice here.
तेर बुकड़ा रेग बुला फिन पाड़ी ले दिली पानी पीने गई तो हली फंसी गई तीने बोरी मर गई एक गाय ते गाय भी फंसी मर पेट में बसो तो सी भी मर गई 60 बुकड़ी थी तीने माँ 4-5 एक बुकड़ी से मुंगरू खाई खाई मिटाड़ देना पेला मुनी देखते ला काई नहीं कोई तो पड़े तो माल भी हुके तो मान है पुन हुके तो बीता बीता जाए ना उन पड़ते ये सेला सुरा भी हसोने काठी से आमरो खेती डूब गईली वाजेन कांदे हुदला हमरो जंगल बाह से जंगल का बाह को ये नोन का आय को ये हमरी कोरी नाम जीवरेला जंगल उजाड़ी काटी कुटीन उजाड़ी देवे दाना देव झाड़ बीड़ गाठाड़ीन एने वागोन रिछो गाठाड़ीन सरकार का होतरी मोटी लांड मिलती इते लांडी बात छे ने ते तेरो मुंड रुक ले दलो मुंडो गोले फांदा गई ते आफरू निकोणी ने अतरे आंबो तेरो मुंड रुकाई गयो ते आफरू हे जावणी नी ते पेल कोहली खाजी वही तो ती कौन देखे तू ते जाड़ जोइन बंद कर देने ते जाई का तेरा पेटो में कतरो से कतरो मरिया ने कतरो काई आज So
what she says essentially is that for us, rivers and forests may be resources to exploit for profit, but for people who are dependent and live on these resources, the relationship is the forest is the father, the river is the mother. And when you build a dam on this, of this magnitude, you're choking, you're killing the river. And with it, all the other living things in her belly, on her banks, and slowly when they die, even the human beings die. So this is this sentiment is not new. It's been repeated again and again before independence, in the struggle in Mulshi Satyagraha. If you see what one of the leaders, Vinayak Biskute, said, that by submerging the lands of the farmers, capitalists like the Tatas needed both electricity and labor. And it was against this capitalist class that the farmers of Mulshi started a rebellion. Mona Bhan, cultural anthropologist on Kishanganga Dam, says there were concerns as to how dams were being weaponized. to ensure extermination of people from that landscape. And this realization is very much there in countries in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, everywhere. And when the tensions between India and Pakistan recently increased, our water resource minister at that time in 2018, Nitin Gadkari, said, "Center will build dams to stop waters from flowing to Pakistan." And when we talk of the dams being built on the Brahmaputra or Mekong, the Indian media very clearly says using dams as weapons, China's expansion is designed. So this whole legacy of conquering rivers and pushing them and exploiting natural resources has continued post-independence also. And I would say that the institutions, international financial institutions, have continued to play that role. We continue to have their major interventions in all these countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nandini, for your wonderful presentation and insight on Narmada. My question is that, when people settle to other places or forced to settle to other places, there's always a conflict between the guest and host. So always hosts believe that they are going to be a burden on our resources, or so have you come across anything like that? Because I during my writing paper on Narmada Bachao Andolan 2 years back, I met many and they told me that they are not welcome by those people where they have been replaced, and they always feel that Narmada is our mother, so we cannot see, and then we feel that we are alone, we are like orphans, something like that. So please let us know during discussion session. Thanks for wonderful presentation. Finally, I would like to welcome Robert to make his presentation. Robert.
Yes, hello all. Let me just share my screen.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Can you see that all right?
Yeah. Cover of your book.
Excellent. Yeah, exactly. So start with a shameless plug for the book. So thank you for the introduction and the invite to speak today. I'm going to give a brief talk about British colonial attempts to understand, control and govern the Hooghly River in Bengal. We heard earlier a little bit about the Hooghly from Iftikhar. I'm going to suggest that controlling the Hooghly, or mastering it, we could say, was a pragmatic response to the challenges that the river presented during the colonial period, but also an important symbolic endeavour, representing to British colonial officials the advance of civilization, or the triumph of humans over nature. As scholars, though, we need to avoid the temptation to narrate and understand human attempts to control natural environments through this prism of progress, not dissimilar, in fact, very similar to the development paradigm that Nandini just spoke to us about. The history of British attempts to control the river is not a straightforward story of the triumph of science and technology or of British enterprise. And contrary to the beliefs of many Victorian era adherents to the creed of progress, colonial technological innovation did not constitute the unequivocal mastery of the natural world. As we will see, the advance of colonial era technology and science was more about adaptation to and negotiation with natural environments like the Hooghly River, rather than their simple conquest. Despite repeated attempts to tame and manage it, the Hooghly, I'm going to suggest, remained beyond complete human control, and as such, exposed the limits of British power in relation to the natural world in South Asia in the 19th century. And as that century drew to a close, British authorities came to realize that their mastery of the river and indeed of the wider natural environment of India would never be complete. The book is part of a larger, but the paper today is part of a larger book project on the global history of the Hooghly River, how the river was integrated into global networks of trade and exchange during the European colonial age. When I started writing the book, the river was a stage essentially. I wanted to write a book about European colonialism. And what was interesting was the presence on the river of not just the English, but the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and other Europeans in close proximity to each other. So my intention was not to write an environmental history, but over time, the relationship between people and the river, and specifically the human attempts to control the river and to profit from it, became one of the book's principal concerns. Okay. As most of you will, of course, know, the Hooghly is a distributary of the Ganges. It crosses Bengal at the western extremity of the Bengal Delta over a distance of about 500 kilometers to arrive in the Bay of Bengal. Control of the Hooghly was essential to the European colonial enterprise in Bengal for various reasons. As the main artery of transport up and down the western part of the Bengal Delta, it facilitated trade and enabled the exploitation of Northeast India's natural resources. From the late 18th century, the river was also important to the entrenching of British rule in Bengal. British officials and soldiers and administrators relied heavily upon the river for the transport of civil and military personnel and for the movement of supplies and information. And as Calcutta grew into the capital of British India, the river was indispensable for the provision of food and water and for the health and hygiene of the city's inhabitants. From the moment of their arrival in Bengal, however, agents of the English East India Company were aware that navigating the river was far from straightforward. In its lower reaches, the Hooghly was dangerously unpredictable, its shifting sandbanks and shoals ruining many ships. And higher up, so I'm thinking probably beyond upriver from Calcutta, the river's navigable channels would change dramatically from one season to the next, with variations in tidal and freshwater inflows leading to the buildup of silt, regularly causing the river to change direction or burst its banks. In response to this unpredictability, we can understand that British officials would attempt to better understand the river by studying and mapping it. The map that you can see here was completed by Major James Rennell, the first East India Company's Surveyor General of Bengal, who produced maps and atlases of large parts of North India from the 1760s onwards, that included information on the winds and currents of the Hooghly and other rivers. This is a slightly later map by Rennell, and if we zoom in to have a look at a detail, we can see an attempt to understand the layout of the sandbanks and shoals at the mouth of the Hooghly River, and the arrows representing the currents, particularly the tidal inflow from the Bay of Bengal into the Hooghly. There's also some letters here representing various shipwrecks, an indication or a confirmation really of just how dangerous entering the Hooghly was. The various ships wrecked on the different shoals at the mouth of the river. Before long, attempts to map and understand the river gave way to British attempts to try to improve the river to render it more navigable, more predictable, and I guess more docile, we could say. In the 1830s, the post of river surveyor was created in the East India Company's administration, and Richard Lloyd produced new charts of the river from Calcutta down to the sea and then northwards, upriver, attempting to measure the river's currents and depths. His conclusion was that drastic intervention was required to maintain the river's navigability. And in the years that followed Lloyd's surveys, first efforts were made to improve the river through engineering. So the shoals of the riverbed were stirred using a specially designed rake dragged by a tugboat. Efforts were made to increase the supply of fresh water into the Hooghly from the Ganges, an early predecessor of the Farakka barrage that Iftikhar spoke to us about earlier. And embankments were constructed along the Hooghly to narrow and deepen the river and prevent water from spilling out. In the middle of the 19th century, the first attempts were also made to develop docks and port facilities around Calcutta, as the importance of the city in the imperial economy grew, and also to construct canals around Calcutta to improve navigation between the Hooghly and the rest of the Bengal Delta going eastwards. Improving the navigability of the river assumed even more importance with the arrival of steam technology in Bengal in the 1830s. In Britain and America, the use of steam to propel boats was already 3 decades old by this point. But in India, British officials were skeptical about the possibilities of introducing steam navigation on the Hooghly and other rivers. Gradually this changed, and by the 1830s, regular steamer services were moving up and down the Hooghly, linking Calcutta with North India and the eastern Bengal Delta. In British attempts to render the Hooghly more navigable and introduce steamships, there was, of course, an element of pragmatism. Combined, these initiatives would make transport on the Hooghly faster and easier, freeing it from the uncertainties of wind, current, and tide. But this was coupled by the middle third of the 19th century by an ideological commitment. In British minds, steam was synonymous with progress. Steam technology and the river engineering efforts it demanded symbolized the progress of man and his mastery of nature. Thomas Prinsep, a captain of one of the first steamships in Bengal, and also an artist. It's his painting that you can see here of one steamship struggling up the river Ganges, having negotiated the Hooghly. There's an excellent quote by Thomas Prinsep that captures this faith in the power of steam to promote civilization. Prinsep says, quote, "Steam technology will promote the convenience and increase the powers of mankind, diffusing over the world an activity, the effect of which, in extending the power of civilization, the most sanguine would not venture to prophesy." When we consider the record of British attempts to control and improve the Hooghly through the course of the 19th century, examples of success are found. So specific channels were deepened and navigability improved. But these successes were largely short-lived. Changes in the current and direction of the river meant that channels navigable in one season could be found too shallow or entirely dried up in the next. Embankments collapsed, sometimes with disastrous consequences for surrounding villages. The silting up of the river over time severely hindered the growth of steam shipping. Journey times were very long in comparison with the similar distances covered by steamers on other rivers around the world, with certain stretches of the Hooghly only navigable during the summer months after the monsoon. The construction of port facilities on the river was also a project fraught with danger. The image that you can see here is of the collapse of one of the walls of the Hydropower docks on the edge of Calcutta just after the construction had been finished in 1890. After many delays in the Hydropower docks project, the collapse of this wall confirmed to many British engineers and observers just how difficult attempts to improve and render more productive the river were. In parallel, extreme weather events like the 1864 cyclone that you can see in this image challenged the British sense of control over the natural environment of India. Over time then, we begin to see a change in British colonial discourse. First came the notion that the Hooghly was fundamentally different to rivers in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, where the raking of riverbeds to disturb shoals and thereby deepen channels had proven successful on English rivers like the Tees. Why was it not working on the Hooghly? On the Danube and Rhine, the construction of embankments to increase water levels had proven a great success. So why on the Hooghly had this failed? On the River Thames, another river with a large tidal inflow, the construction of docks had proven straightforward. So why was the Hooghly different? Before long, this assertion of difference begot the notion that fully understanding the Hooghly was impossible, while improving it was destined to fail. In 1882, government oceanographers admitted large discrepancies between the Hooghly's predicted and actual tides, and conceded that the river's tidal movements could not be fully known. Authorities determined that maintaining deep channels at the river's mouth was impossible, and instead invested their resources in a pilot service to guide all ships between Calcutta and the sea. One official report acknowledged that the Hooghly was, quote, undoubtedly one of the most dangerous rivers of the world, end quote. Meanwhile, attempts to improve the navigability of the river in its upper reaches were all but abandoned, with one government report describing the area where the Hooghly separated from the Ganges as, quote, a land of dead and dying rivers whose beds are out of reach of the scour of the tides and of great rice swamps which will never now be filled. I'd like to finish with a few reflections on the wider significance of the failure of British attempts to fully master the Hooghly in this period. As the 19th century drew to a close, many colonial administrators remained wedded to the idea that through scientific inquiry and new technologies, the natural environment of India could be understood and controlled. But this was increasingly punctuated by doubt and a growing notion that in spite of progress in science and technology, India's natural environment would remain unpredictable and unruly. And if we look at English newspapers in Bengal at the end of the 19th century, they are filled with stories about natural disasters, crop failures, floods, disease epidemics, cyclones, and tidal waves that seem to confirm this sense of nature out of control. Some British figures began wondering if the manipulation of India's natural environment by human actors was not in some way contributing to environmental problems. We see, for example, the first attempts to conserve and protect Indian nature. Concerns were expressed about ecological effects of redirecting the natural flow of rivers and streams, the idea that the Hooghly and other waterways around Calcutta were being overfished was considered, and government attempts to protect and replant forests across Bengal got underway. The combination of confidence and anxiety, faith in the creed of progress and growing doubt that I've just spoken about was equally evident in British discourse about the city of Calcutta itself. Calcutta was, of course, dependent on the Hooghly. By the end of the 19th century, it was, by the standards of the time, a megacity of about 1 million people, many of whom had arrived by the river through networks of migration and whose livelihoods depended on it. British rhetoric about Calcutta was often self-congratulatory. There's the cliche, of course, of a city of palaces built on a swamp, or of a global economic center being created where once there had just been a village. But in parallel, we see an explosion at the end of the 19th century of British concerns about the dirtiness, the unhealthiness, the insalubrity of Calcutta. The idea that the city, like the Hooghly, was a problem. Apologies, my Wi-Fi drops occasionally. I was just moving on to my final slide and conclusion. So I will return to that just for a minute. I was speaking about the city of Calcutta and how British officials and others were at the same time self-congratulatory about the idea of a city that had conquered nature, but also concerned about the city being out of control and about the forces of nature in Bengal not being fully controlled in Calcutta. A good example is the attempts of British engineers to introduce supplies of clean drinking water and an effective sewage system in Calcutta, both of which met with limited success. To conclude then, the failure of British authorities to fully understand and master the Hooghly exposed the limits of British colonial power in relation to the natural environments of India. This in turn contributed to an ideological shift in British colonial discourse, whereby faith in the creed of progress was shaken, and the transformation and improvement of India was, at least for some, no longer the main justification for British colonial rule. The protection of the people of Bengal from the ravages of nature assumed importance as an object of colonial governments, particularly after extreme weather events like the 1864 cyclone that I spoke about. But at the same time, and with a degree of irony, I guess, British officials recognized that their control of environmental forces was far from absolute. One of the very interesting things to come out of the panel today and the other presentations that we heard was the idea that, at least to an extent, the colonial logic of development and the idea that the state can take control and manage the forces of nature has been reproduced in the post-colonial period. And maybe that's something we want to come back to in discussion now. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert, for your wonderful presentation. In fact, the Hooghly project started by the British and had support from the upper caste Hindu elites, but it was opposed by many marginalized groups, especially the fishing community. And it was Shudra Queen Rashmoni Das was in 1840s, she fought and protected the fishing community's rights. So during your discussion, could you please look at this, marginalized communities coming together and fighting against the British, while the dominant groups and who see the British as their patrons were just siding with the projects. So we already have crossed the time. So I now request all of you to please respond to questions which I asked, and but very briefly, maybe with 2 minutes or max 2.5 minutes. So let's start with David. And in case the audience have any questions, please write to us in chat box, If you have a question to all panels, just write. Otherwise, if you have question to any particular individual, just mention his or her name. So David, start.
Thanks. So I think I'd like to begin my reflections on the question that you posed, Amit, by taking off from the point that we were just hearing made about the Hugli and the perpetuation of the ideology of control and mastery of nature into the post-colonial period. And I think that there's a connection between that that strategy, which was later called the hydraulic mission of mastering nature and rivers to direct them to human needs. There's a connection between that hydraulic mission, that search for mastery, and what you, Amit, have called the water nationalism in the South Asian context, and that they are linked through the politics and the exercise of state power. That it's the construction of infrastructure to serve state ends that enables this this mastery, but in the logic of control. And water nationalism is not conducive necessarily to the recognition of human needs, of communal values, and certainly not conducive to international cooperation across transboundary rivers. To come to your specific question about India, Pakistan, and the Indus, that there is a conflict and an ideological conflict, not necessarily a management conflict, but an ideological conflict between the construction and the management and use of water infrastructure, particularly hard infrastructure, dams, canals, hydropower facilities, and the need for cooperation in the face of ecosystemic challenges represented, for example, by climate change. In that climate change is in contrast to the normal, or let's say the traditional security dilemmas that states face. Climate change is what's been called an actorless threat. In that the risk is not generated by another government, another state, but by the combined pressures of humanity on natural ecosystems. So one might wish to argue that recognition of the nature of that threat could facilitate cooperation to address shared dangers of increased variability in water supplies or natural disasters, flooding and drought, that would be faced by both India and Pakistan on the Indus. And yet, the obstacle, as many of those here present in this conference have argued, the obstacle is largely one of political will. To underlie that cooperation and that ongoing dynamic that understands the role of the state and government power in water management to be control rather than realization of a larger concept of human benefits, which include the economic, but also community, social cohesion, the spiritual values of water. That the mastery dynamic is really sitting on top of all of those other needs and potential benefits, and is constituting a real obstacle to the type of cooperation that you evoked.
Thanks, David. Iftikhar, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would agree with you that there are different versions of the conversations and negotiation in those transitional and highly volatile time. And as environmental historians dig into the minds of archives, there will be many more to come. And so I totally agree with that. And at the same time, if we look at the de facto map making, and we know that by the same political logic by which India was partitioned into Pakistan and India, Farakka point shouldn't be in India, you know. it should be in Bangladesh. So the whole historical trajectory could have been completely different. So this is, I think, what we might also need to remember. And second, your second point about Dhaka and wetland, I think this is interesting point. If I may just share this, if you give me 30 seconds, it should be there. Yeah, there we are. Yeah, this is just after 55 millimeter of rain, somewhere in sometime in October in 2020. And this is probably, this reminds, that will remind us of Mumbai or Karachi, almost same. But in the case of Dhaka, I think this is a bit, odd in the context of these, that actually Dhaka has a 4 river, and some of these rivers are actually larger than Thames or even part of Hooghly or Bhagirathi, and Dhaka is circled by that. And then there are 26 canals. There are much more, but at least 26 canals are there that can be traceable. So the drainage system shouldn't be a problem, So much more rain should also not lead to that kind of clogging. So what happened? Actually, this is because of the grabbing of the wetlands, and that has you can see from over the last 40 years, the wetland areas, how these have disappeared. So this is only natural that Dhaka is really facing the great ecological and other environmental problem. And as you know, Dhaka is the 6th largest mega cities in the world, and it is probably going to replace Shanghai in 20 to 25 years time to secure probably 2nd or 3rd position. So already they're showing the problem of flooding and problem of groundwater water depletion, and also natural drainage system, and the problem of groundwater depletion and moisture and all these things. So this is not looking good, but recently there has been some efforts to reclaim and excavate some of these canals, and Dhaka Bangladesh court has also made the rivers as alive after New Zealand and Jharkhand. So let's see how it goes, whether we see a mega city with some sort of sustainability or as a platform or the stadium of failure. Let's see. Thank you.
Thanks. Nandini?
Yes, people, I mean, you could listen to some of the interviews of the people who've been, displaced. I put up on the Narmada Oral History website, how they never feel at home, even after 10, 15 years in the resettlement sites. There have been conflicts. Those interviews are there on the website with English subtitles. But let me tell you from my own experience, while I was an activist, there was a very serious conflict when 4,500 hectares of forest was being converted as resettlement sites for 33 villages to be displaced in Maharashtra. The conflict between the host community and the new settlers escalated to an extent that in a police firing, one of the Adivasi women from the host villages was shot dead, Dhanibai. So yes, there is not only conflict between host and the new settlers, but the new people who come are often resettled some 100, 200, 150 kilometers away, where the language, food habits, agricultural practices, everything is different, So to really settle down when it is forcible displacement, it is very, very difficult. And people often end up then, as labor, cheap labor in the surrounding areas. So yes, we have seen this all the time. in the Sardasura project, in spite of it being claimed by the government that it is one of the best rehabilitation policies in the country.
Thanks, Nandini. So Robert, last.
Yeah, great. Maybe just to add, and possibly to continue answering the question that I posed at the end of my talk about the continuity between colonial and post-colonial periods. The final chapter of Hooghly looks exactly at that, about how attempts to control and manage the Hooghly and to improve it, in inverted commas, have been continued by the Indian state post-independence. Not least with the Farakka barrage that Carl spoke to us about. One consequence of that, as we heard, is of course the water disputes between India and Pakistan or Bangladesh. Resolving those disputes is undoubtedly partly about political will, as David mentioned to us in his comments just now. But I think there's also a more fundamental point about whether or not nation states are fit for purpose as an organizational structure for being able to, well, come up with solutions that are necessarily transboundary or transnational. One of the advantages, this is perhaps a slightly whimsical point, but one of the advantages of looking at the long sweep of history on the Hooghly, and also looking at how identities have changed and been fluid on the Hooghly through the centuries, is to pose that question about the permanence and suitability of the nation state as a political entity. And that idea that the nation state might not be best equipped to deal with environmental concerns becomes even more obvious, even more stark, when we start thinking about global heating and rising sea levels and their impact on the Bengal Delta and the wider, well, Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean. The fact that those solutions to those questions are inevitably transnational calls for logic, I guess, of those national boundaries and of the nation state into question.
Thanks, Robert. Finally, I thank all panelists for stimulating presentation and also the audience. Now over to Vinny for concluding session. Vinny.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjan. We've come to the end of the conference. We'd like to thank all the panelists and the chairpersons for such a wonderful discussion. We'd also like to thank all the participants for being a part of this conference. We hope to see you again for future ISAS events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see
Thanks,
all of you.